Troglodyte warning. Today I'm going to break down a video that poses a question that I get asked quite a lot. And that's, what are the far right and are Reform UK a far right party? So this video is from Richard Murphy. Go and subscribe to his channel. He does some really good stuff. And he really goes into great detail and breaks down the parts and constituent parts of what the far right are and where reform fit into this. So let's get straight into the video.
Are right in British politics? And how do I think that reform relates to that definition? It's a question that I'm being asked, and given the significance of reform in the UK's current political environment and the rise of the far right, in my opinion, around the world, it seems an appropriate time to answer the question. 2025 is, in political terms, going to be dominated by these parties, and they are going to try to create narratives that upset the status quo within the politics of the UK as a consequence, and therefore it seems right to define the terms that I use when I describe a political party as being on the far right. There are quite a number of ways in which I think that this is flagged, and I'm going to highlight a whole series of them. They aren't in numerical order. They aren't necessarily in order of priority. The point is that you have to assemble this evidence across a whole range of indicators to suggest fairly conclusively that a party is on the far right. And that's what I intend to do in this video. The first indication that there is that a party might be on the far right is that it is considered by just about everybody in a society to be further right than all the existing current political parties. And this is undoubtedly true of reform in the UK. There isn't anybody who pretends that reform is not at least on the right wing of the Conservative Party or further right than it. And remember that the Tories have shifted significantly towards their right wing over the last decade and moved.
That's an important point. So it's all about context of the other political parties. So you've got Labour that are centre right, Conservatives right wing. You've got Lib Dems that are probably centre left, and then you've got the Greens that are left wing. So it's the context of the political environment you're in. So people say, oh, 30 years ago it would have been, yes, 30 years ago maybe, but we're not in 30 years ago. So it's context dependent on the other political parties and how the Overton window in the last 14 years has shifted to the right. Anti-immigration, nationalist talking points have become more mainstream. So yes, it depends on the other parties and the context of the political spectrum.
Moved away from their old one nation view of the world. So just on that basis alone, purely technically, reform is clearly on the far right of politics, because if the Tories are in the centre right and Labour is in the moderate right, then reform must be on the far right, and technically that's a term we can use simply to describe where they are. But that isn't sufficient in itself to explain whether they're on the far right. There have to be these other things as well. One of those is a decided bias towards wealth and against working people. And I think we can see that in the behaviour of reform. It's all in favour of cutting taxes on the wealth. It doesn't like inheritance tax. It doesn't like capital gains tax. It's biased against corporation tax. But as importantly, it is providing no indication of real support for working people and their rights. And many of its policies would remove the social safety net on which so many people in the UK are dependent. This is a clear bias towards the wealthy at cost to those who work for a living and who are dependent upon the state to provide services that they could not afford for themselves, and that is an indication of a far-right party.
So this fake populism that doesn't support the workers, cut public spending, tax cuts for the wealthy, cutting regulation for business that will affect the consumer and the worker. So it's this illusion that, oh yeah, they care for the working people, whereas they are in the pocket of corporate interests massively. Nigel Farage, Rupert Lowe, Richard Tice, Wealth, I mean, they're all business owners in their own rights. I mean, Reform UK literally is a limited company, it's a business. So they are very much in the interest of business. Fake populism. They don't care about the working people. Classic far right trope.
Reform is also biased towards corporations or companies. It favours deregulation, which would massively increase the profitability of large companies who did not have to comply with that regulation, which has been put in place to protect us from harm. It is not in favour of accountability. It doesn't appear to want large companies to be accountable for their behaviour. And we can see this most particularly with regard to climate change and the abuse of the climate that large companies do. Reform is basically in denial about the fact that this problem even exists and therefore of the need to be accountable for it.
Classic far right trope, like an anti intellectual denial of science, scientific consensus, skepticism of the academies and scientific rigor. They just don't believe in it. And that's a classic far right trope. It's inconvenient to their corporate bottom line.
As a consequence, it also wants to liberate companies from this constraint, which they think exists on their profit, and as I've already mentioned, it wants low corporation tax. Reform seeks to shrink the role of government, and that is another indication of a far-right party. It wants actual cuts in government spending and says that they must come. In particular, it questions the role and even the existence of the NHS, which is anathema to most people in the UK, but which Nigel Farage has promoted for a long time, suggesting that there are insurance-based alternatives, which would, however, be largely unaffordable for most people. Look at the USA for evidence of that. And in general, whatever it is that the government does, Reform want less to be done. This is a clear indication of a far-right agenda. I also think Reform has a disdain for democracy. Let's look at the clearest indication of this. Reform is a private limited company controlled by Nigel Farage. There is actually no democracy within this political party, or what it claims to be a political party, because Nigel Farage decides what happens. You could not get a clearer indication for disdain of democratic process within a political party than that. It's not accountable to anyone, as is apparent from the promotions and sackings that take place in that party on a regular basis. And I believe that is an indication of the approach of Reform to democracy as a whole.
And we don't talk about that enough. The fact that Nigel Farage is the Reform UK party. He has complete dominion, complete control, and that says a lot about their views of democracy. They don't see democracy as a positive force. They are authoritarian. Yes, they pay lip service to it. Yes, they pay lip service to the power of the people and the voice of the people. But the majority don't represent the reform. And they know that. So they have to have this fake populism, this fake democratic veneer. But the structures of the party are not democratic. It says a lot.
Reform also highlights the significance of military power. There's nothing that Nigel Farage likes more than the chance to be a little bit jingoistic. On the beaches in Normandy, whenever there's an anniversary, he wants to be there celebrating the forces. But he also wants an increase in spending on the forces at a time when he wants to cut government spending in general. This dependence on the forces is a very clear indication of a far-right party.
Oh, massively so. The same with Donald Trump. They want to cut public spending, but they'd never cut military spending. It went up under Trump. It's going to go up again year on year. That's where they want to raise public, which is, again, classic militarism, authoritarianism, the idea that we've got to protect and, other public spending, education, healthcare, that can be privatized, but we put public money into arming and killing people.
He also seeks to link politics and religion. And Richard Tice, the deputy leader of Reform, does this perhaps more often than Nigel Farage himself. He frequently refers to the UK as a Christian country. But there's no evidence for that.
No.
Latest surveys and the census all indicate that the majority of people in the UK are now ambivalent about their relationship to any religion. And the actual number of people attending Christian worship is now in a tiny percentage. So this claim that we're a Christian country, which Reform uses to reinforce its agenda against those of other faiths, most of whom do, of course, come from migrant or ethnic minority populations, is a deliberate use of the church as a political positioning weapon. And that is a very clear indication of far-right alignment.
Oh, massively. Christian culturalism, or a cultural Christian, is classic dog whistle that they use now. Like, all of a sudden, you see people like Paul Thorpe, all of a sudden they're Christians. They realize they're Christians, but because it is a dog whistle, it's a dog whistle to whiteness and the fact that even though these people aren't Christian, they don't have Christian values, they don't go to church on a Sunday, but they use it as a means to say, we are Christian, i.e., in opposition to essentially Islam. But again, it kind of shows them their anti-freedom of religion chops. Again, they don't care about freedom of religion. They think where this country is a Christian nation, which it isn't objectively. Most people aren't Christian. We are very much an atheist. We've got a history of atheism. We are very much an atheist country, very secular and skeptical of religion. Again, tiny minority who will actually be practicing Christians. So the idea that, but again, they know what they're doing. They have to have this perception of we are somehow this Christian nation. Simply not true.
Reform seeks to control the media. It is very clear that it has no time for media regulation, and it is a great lover of GB News.
Yeah.
It also favours those other outlets that are very much inclined to promote far-right thinking, including the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, and others. And do remember, the Daily Mail has a very unfortunate history in this respect. It is clearly not interested in unbiased news reporting, and its frequent attacks on the BBC are a clear indication of that. It also seeks to control freedom of speech and
Massively.
protest.
Yep.
Now, this is obviously linked to the control of the media, but extends that issue. It wants to limit the right of unions to protest. It wants to limit the right of those from the left to protest.
Yep.
And we have seen it actively opposing those rights, whilst Nigel Farage willingly turns up on demonstrations by farmers. There is a bias in this which is very apparent, and it's towards the far right. But there's also something else about Reform which is very typical of the far right. It has a disdain for the arts, for experts, intellectuals and universities. This is a far-right characteristic which it is very clearly aligned with.
Yeah. Massively so. One of the biggest indications for me of Reform being far-right is their intentions to ban gender ideology in universities and critical race theory, which are academic examples just of academic freedom. The idea that we can discuss ideas, and they want to ban that. That is the most authoritarian position you can have. I'm sorry, that is far-right ideology. And they'll deny it and be like, no, academics should be able to talk about whatever they want, as long as it's evidence-based, there's rigor, and it's not prejudice. So, again, they don't care about freedom of speech. It's a cudgel. It's a means to deflect any responsibility for when they say racist things or they stir up hate.
Reform also promotes family values. Nothing pleases it more than the idea of the wife at home, and there's a lot of appeal to people to increase the number of children they have. This is how they wish to deal with the flood of migrants, by having more white children. This idea is deeply offensive to most. It's also utterly economically unsustainable in the world in which we now live. But reform promotes it nonetheless. And I think that is strongly misogynistic, which is, of course, another one of the characteristics that I would suggest.
Yeah, even Farage said that we need to have a question about abortion in the UK. I'm sorry, it's been done and dusted. Yeah, they have that discussion in America, but I'm sorry, women have the freedom to choose what they do with their bodies. It has nothing to do with Nigel Farage.
Are apparent from its behaviour. That, to me, is deeply worrying. Reform is also strongly nationalistic. That nationalism is not, of course, for the United Kingdom. Reform is in complete denial about the nature of the United Kingdom, basically ignoring the existence of Northern Ireland and Wales and Scotland, and only presuming that England is of consequence. English nationalism and English exceptionalism are the basis for its nationalism. But this is typical of the far right. They draw boundaries to suit their own purpose.
Yep.
And that is what the far right in the form of reform are doing here. They are defining what is the country to suit their own image of what they wish it to be, not what it actually is.
Yeah, that's a massive one because they assume that, again, Christian white. No, I mean, we're such a diverse country. We are ethnically, religiously, our political views, our cultures, our history. We are a tiny island of immigrants, and that's really complicated. Our history is complicated, and we are not just one thing, but they want us to fit this, and that's fascism, that's far right ideology, a very narrow view of heterosexual, Christian values, family values, militarism, nationalism. No, most people actually reject these values. They're traditional and regressive values that actually most people don't ascribe to anymore. It's kind of something of the past. People are individuals, they do their own thing. They don't have allegiance to the nation. They'll have allegiance to the family or their job or their communities. But the idea of this nebulous view of, oh, England exceptionalism, which is a bygone era, I'm sorry, it's gone. We aren't the best in the world anymore. So, yes, and again, it's far right tropes, but they will be in complete denial about all these. They'll just be like, oh, no, because the evidence is overwhelming. But again, they don't care about evidence.
As a consequence, they're dismissing the rights, opinions, and opportunities of 15% of the people in the United Kingdom, as it now is, who they presume they can subject to their rule without question arising. But they do the same with regard to other countries as well. Nobody, of course, was more in favour of Brexit than reform and its various Farage predecessors. This whole process of defining the UK, or rather England, as a country apart is a very right-wing trope, and is only breached in one situation, of course, which is that Farage would like to align us with the USA, of which I frankly think he would like us to become the 51st, 52nd or 53rd state, depending upon the order in which Trump manages to take over Canada and Greenland and us and anybody else who he thinks should be within his domain. But Farage likes that, but doesn't want to actually define us as having relationships with anyone else. And this is a far-right trope. Reform seeks to deny the rights of minorities. LGBTQ plus rights are not on its agenda.
Yeah, 2/3 of Reform voters don't think that trans people should have the right to legally change their gender. So, again, an anti freedom argument. They don't believe in trans rights. They think whatever they think, but they do not believe that trans people should have the freedom to determine their own bodies, what they do with their own selves, as long as they're not harming people. And sorry, this is a classic far right trope. Transness in 1930s Germany was seen as degenerate, and the way they talk about trans people, it's a very similar view.
Already mentioned its position with regard to women, which I think is deeply misogynistic, and it does appear that it is quite contemptuous.
And this is a far right trope as well. The idea that any mental health issues are somehow like a personal failing or somehow not real. It's like mental health, it's like, oh, just pull at your bootstraps, just get on with it. They kind of ignore the realities of like the mental health problems that our capitalist world faces. Like the fact that people work meaningless jobs, they don't have meaning, they don't have community. And to them, they just should have to just get on with it, shut up, continue working, and don't question the economic reality, the inequality. They don't even recognize mental illness often. And it's just creates, exacerbates the problem.
Of those with mental ill health and those who are not from the mainstream thinking within the UK, as a consequence, sidelining all those with autism and ADHD and with any other form of neurodivergent condition.
Yeah, Russell Brand is the big one for this now. He's linking vaccines to autism, which is no evidence. And it's a far right trope of the idea that, if you don't meet this kind of heteronormative, this kind of narrow view of human personhood, that you're not a human in a way. It's, and again, this is fascism. This is like you have to meet the Aryan race. You have to be this purity. And I'm sorry, when you seek purity in a population, there's always going to be people who don't match your ideal view of what it means to be an Englishman or whatever. Because it's so narrow.
Which actually means that they're more than able to operate in society so long as society recognizes that they do not operate in a neurotypical fashion.
Yeah.
Neurotypicality is what reform wants, as does, of course, Kemi Badenoch, but they appear aligned on this point.
Yeah.
And that is the clearest indication of this lack of tolerance of minorities, which is, of course, then seen in reform's populist nature. Now, reform is fundamentally populist. It seeks to other groups in society, by which I mean it tries to define people as not of the mainstream. And I've just mentioned some groups that it does not want in the mainstream, and we are, of course, always aware of the fact that so much that has come from Nigel Farage is what looks racist to some people, but if it isn't racist, is most certainly against the best interests of those from ethnic minorities and is fundamentally opposed to migration, with that opposition to migration appearing to be much higher in the case of those who happen to not be white or male. And this, to me, I think, is a clear indication of populist anti-migrant narratives, which are also reflected in its demand that those who do come to the UK assimilate and abandon their own cultures, for which there is no reason, because those cultures add to the diversity and joy of life in the UK. But perhaps most of all, this policy is indifferent to the creation of fear or of the causing of offence, which appears to be such a part of the programme that reform wants to promote. There is a refusal at the very heart of this programme to recognise the multi-country, multicultural nature of the United Kingdom as a whole, which is aligned with the English nationalism to which I've already referred. This is a trope from the far right, and I believe it aligns reform with the far right. And finally, and let's...
Which fundamentally is an anti-freedom argument. The idea that like this culture is this kind of ever, it's inert, it stays in one period. No, culture is constantly changing ethnic demographics. Cultures add to each other, different people come in, they bring their food, they bring different ways of thinking. This is how history has progressed. And this is how this nation has been built by different people, different ethnic origins coming in. But they just assume that it's always just been this kind of whiteness, this Anglo-Saxon supremacy, and it's just ahistorical. It's not. When you look at history, it's massively complicated. People since the Beaker people 4,400 years ago have come to this island and made it what it is. And it's changing constantly. Change is inevitable, but they're trying to fight against it, and it's not natural because it's going to change. In 100 years, the UK is going to look different to what it does now. And that's okay.
Just mention it. There is cronyism. Cronyism is, of course, normally associated with corruption. And I'm not suggesting that reform is corrupt, but I am suggesting that it might be afflicted with cronyism. And how do I know? I'll go back to another point I've already mentioned. The fact that Nigel Farage will not tolerate any form of opposition to his views within the party that he has created. He risked it with UKIP. He risked it with the Brexit Party, but he will not risk it with reform. He is in control.
And that's why Ben Habib left. He saw that Nigel Farage is in complete control. There's no democracy. There's no shared vision. It's all Nigel. And that's where far right parties become inherently self destructive. And I think that's what we're going to see in the next few years. People say, yeah, there will be a peak in a couple of years, maybe, but it's just going to self destruct like UKIP did, like the BNP did, like the EDL did. They are inherently full of ego, narcissism, and they fall apart inherently. And fascism is self destructive, it eats itself because it's constantly seeking enemies and war, and it leads to infighting. And yes, already we've seen glimmers of it with Nigel Farage and his supporters. There's a lot of people who are getting sick of Farage. And will they split apart? I think they will, but it's a question of when.
And if that isn't a definition of cronyism, in the sense that those who wish to get on have to crony up to Nigel, or they have no chance of doing so, then I don't know what is. And this, again, is a clear indication of a far-right movement. So, that's how I view the far right. Those groupings are what I think are significant, and why I think Reform is a far-right party. I know that there will be those who disagree, and they're very welcome to do so. But this is the criteria I'm using, and that is why I think Reform is on the far right, and because I find so many of those issues that it promotes repugnant. That is why I will be spending time in 2025 challenging everything that they and those who are closely aligned to them in the Tory party stand for. Thanks for watching this.
And I will be doing the same on this channel. So tell me your thoughts. I think the evidence is overwhelming. I think it's unequivocal. Tell me your thoughts. Are Reform UK far right? And I'll see you in the next video.